I remember the exact moment it began, because it happened so suddenly that my brain refused to understand what I was seeing. I was standing near the eastern fence of the cemetery, doing another slow patrol with my flashlight cutting through the darkness, when the ground in front of me moved. At first it was subtle, just a faint shifting in the soil, like something underground had turned over in its sleep. Then the dirt lifted, slowly, deliberately. I stood there staring as the fresh mound of earth on a grave began to crack apart, the soil sliding down the sides as if invisible hands were pushing from beneath. The wooden coffin lid buried below the dirt made a hollow, muffled thud. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and stepped back, because graves are not supposed to open on their own. But this one did, right in front of me, and whatever was inside was trying to get out. 3 weeks earlier, I had taken a job as the night security guard at Hollow Ridge Cemetery. It seemed simple enough at the time. Walk the grounds, check the fences, make sure no vandals climbed in after dark. The place was old, older than the town itself, with rows of crooked gravestones and tall, dead trees that scraped against the night sky like skeletal fingers. During the day it looked quiet and forgotten, but at night it felt completely different. The silence there was not peaceful. It was heavy, like the entire cemetery was listening. The man who hired me was an older caretaker who barely spoke during the interview. He handed me the flashlight, the gate key, and a small radio. Just before I left, he looked at me with a strange expression and said something that I did not take seriously at the time. He told me, very calmly, "Whatever happens during the night, make sure you're gone before sunrise." I thought he was joking. After what I saw that night, I realized he probably wasn't.
The night had started like every other shift. The air was cold and a thin fog drifted low across the ground, weaving through the gravestones like pale smoke. My boots crunched softly on the gravel paths as I walked my usual route. The only sound was the wind occasionally brushing the iron gate at the entrance. My flashlight beam moved slowly from one tombstone to another, lighting up names and dates that belonged to people who had been dead for decades. Around midnight, the cemetery always became eerily quiet, as if even the wind was afraid to move. That was when I heard the first sound. It was faint. So faint that I almost convinced myself I imagined it. A soft scraping noise, like dirt sliding. I turned the flashlight toward the sound and walked closer until the beam landed on a freshly filled grave. The soil on top of it trembled again, and this time I knew I wasn't imagining anything. The dirt suddenly cracked apart with a dry, splitting sound, the loose earth collapsing down the sides of the grave. Beneath it, the wooden lid of the coffin pushed upward a few inches with a slow, creaking noise that echoed through the silent cemetery. I felt my chest tighten as my brain desperately tried to explain what was happening. Gas buildup, shifting ground, maybe an animal digging underneath. But then something pale appeared in the narrow gap between the coffin and the soil above it. A hand, gray and thin, with stiff fingers that clawed at the edge of the wood. My breath caught in my throat as another hand appeared beside it. The lid lifted a little higher, and a figure slowly pulled itself upward out of the darkness below. I should have run right then. Any normal person would have turned around and sprinted straight for the gate. But fear froze me where I stood, forcing me to watch as the figure climbed out of the grave and stood upright in the cold night air. The beam of my flashlight trembled as it illuminated the figure's face. The skin looked tight and pale, stretched thin over hollow features, and its clothes were little more than torn fabric coated in damp soil. Its eyes were open but empty, reflecting the light with a dull, lifeless shine. For a moment it simply stood there, swaying slightly as if adjusting to being upright again. Then it turned away from the grave and began walking slowly across the cemetery. It did not stumble like a corpse in a movie. It walked steadily, quietly, its feet moving through the grass with soft, deliberate steps. It did not look at me. It did not make a sound. It simply moved deeper into the rows of gravestones like it had somewhere important to be. My heart pounded in my ears as I slowly turned the flashlight in the direction it was walking. That was when I noticed something that made the fear inside my chest twist into something far worse. Other graves were open, not just one or two. Everywhere the beam of my flashlight landed, I saw dark holes where the earth had been disturbed. Fresh dirt scattered across the ground, coffin lids pushed open beneath broken soil. And from those holes, figures were climbing out. One by one they emerged from the ground, pulling themselves into the night like shadows taking shape. Some looked old, their clothes crumbling with age. Others looked newly buried. Men, women, even a small child whose pale face barely rose above the tall grass. Soon the cemetery was filled with them, silent shapes wandering slowly between the gravestones under the dim light of the moon. I backed away and hid behind a tall marble statue near the center of the cemetery, trying to stay out of sight while I watched them move. My watch read 2:43 in the morning, but time felt completely meaningless as I stared at the dead walking quietly through the graves. None of them spoke. None of them looked at each other. They drifted across the cemetery like sleepwalkers, their empty eyes staring ahead as they passed through the fog. Sometimes one would stop beside a tombstone and stare down at it for a long time before continuing on. Sometimes they wandered in slow circles as if searching for something they had lost. The gate at the entrance of the cemetery stood wide open only a few hundred feet away. If they wanted to leave, they easily could have walked straight through it and disappeared into the sleeping town beyond. But not a single one of them moved toward the exit. Hours passed like that, with the dead wandering quietly under the moonlight while I watched from my hiding place, too terrified to move. Then, just before dawn, something changed. The sky at the edge of the horizon began to lighten, and the fog slowly started to fade. At that exact moment, every single figure in the cemetery stopped walking. They all turned at the same time, their bodies rotating slowly as if responding to a silent command. One by one, they began walking towards specific graves scattered throughout the cemetery. Their graves. I watched as the first figure reached the hole it had climbed out of earlier. Without hesitation, it stepped down into the grave, lowering itself carefully into the darkness. The coffin lid shifted closed, and the loose soil slowly slid back into place above it. Another figure did the same, then another. Within minutes, the wandering dead disappeared one by one beneath the earth, each returning to the grave they had risen from as if the entire night had been nothing more than a routine. When the last figure disappeared underground, the cemetery looked exactly the same as it had at the beginning of my shift. The graves were sealed. The fog was gone. The silence returned. I slowly stepped out from behind the statue, my legs shaking as I stared across the empty rows of gravestones. I thought it was over. I thought the nightmare had ended with the sunrise. But then I noticed something that made the cold fear inside me return all at once. One grave was still open. Just one. A dark hole in the ground near the center of the cemetery where the dirt had not settled back into place. I walked toward it slowly, my flashlight shaking in my hand. Beside the open grave stood a freshly carved headstone that caught the beam of light as I approached. I lowered the flashlight and read the name carved into the stone. The moment I saw it, my entire body went numb. Because the name on that grave was mine. Daniel Carter. Beneath it were the years of my life, ending with tonight's date. And just as the first rays of sunlight began creeping over the horizon, I heard footsteps moving through the grass behind me, slow and quiet, like someone returning to their grave before the morning arrived.
Did you hear that? The words barely left my mouth when the sound came again. A slow, hollow knock coming from beneath the grave directly in front of us. For a moment, none of us moved.
The beam from my flashlight trembled across the cracked tombstone as we stared at the patch of dirt below it. We had come to the cemetery thinking it would be funny to try something stupid we saw online, asking questions to the dead and waiting to see if anything responded. 3 friends in the middle of the night, standing among crooked headstones and overgrown grass, expecting nothing more than silence and maybe a few nervous laughs. But the second I asked, "Is anyone here with us?" something knocked back from underground. It wasn't the sound of a rock shifting or dirt collapsing. It was deliberate. One knock, clear, hollow, like someone hitting wood from below the soil. The silence that followed was heavier than the darkness around us, and the worst part was the way we all slowly looked at each other, realizing every single one of us had heard it. Lucas was the first to laugh, but it was the kind of laugh people make when they are trying to convince themselves everything is normal. He said it was probably a loose stone or some animal digging under the ground, but even he didn't sound convinced. Marcos crouched closer to the grave, shining his phone flashlight across the name carved into the tombstone. The letters were old and worn down by time, but we could still read them. Eleanor Whitaker, 1912 to 1987. Just a normal grave like hundreds of others around it. Nothing special. Nothing that should have been knocking back when someone spoke to it. I remember telling them we should try again, mostly because I wanted to prove there was some logical explanation. So I cleared my throat, leaned slightly toward the grave, and said, "If someone is down there, knock once." For a few seconds, there was nothing. Just wind moving through the trees and the distant hum of a highway somewhere beyond the cemetery walls. Then, knock. This time it was louder, stronger, and it came from exactly the same place beneath the ground. All 3 of us jumped back at the same time. Marcos actually stumbled and nearly fell into another headstone behind him. None of us were laughing anymore. The air felt different, colder somehow, and I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Lucas stepped forward again slowly, as if he couldn't decide whether he was curious or terrified. He swallowed and said, "Okay, if that was real, knock twice." We waited. The seconds stretched out painfully long. I remember thinking maybe we had imagined the whole thing. Maybe our minds were playing tricks on us in the dark. Then the sound came again. Knock, knock. 2 distinct taps from beneath the soil, perfectly spaced apart. Not random, not natural. It sounded exactly like someone answering a question. At that point, the mood shifted completely. What had started as a stupid nighttime challenge suddenly felt like something we shouldn't be doing at all. Marcos whispered that we should leave, but Lucas was already kneeling beside the grave again, staring at the dirt as if he expected it to move. I think curiosity got the better of all of us, because instead of walking away, we started treating it like some kind of twisted conversation. Lucas asked, "Are you a spirit?" A single knock answered from below. We all looked at each other again, silently agreeing on what that meant. 1 knock for yes, 2 knocks for no. My throat felt dry, but I forced myself to keep going. "Were you buried here?" I asked. Knock. The response came immediately this time, like whatever was beneath us was waiting for the question. The more we asked, the stranger it became. Every answer came back with perfect timing. If we asked something that should be no, we heard 2 knocks. If the answer was yes, we heard 1. And the sound itself never changed location. It always came from directly beneath the grave, deep enough to be underground, but clear enough that there was no mistaking it. I remember asking questions about the cemetery itself, whether it liked people visiting, whether it had been alone for a long time. The answers kept coming. 1 knock, 2 knocks, sometimes immediately, sometimes after a pause that felt almost thoughtful. The idea that something under the dirt was actually listening to us started to sink in, and the realization made the back of my neck prickle. After a while, Lucas decided to push things further. His voice shook a little when he spoke, but he still asked the question. "Can you understand what we're saying?" There was a long pause this time. The wind picked up and rustled the trees, making shadows crawl across the graves around us. For a moment, we thought maybe the knocking had stopped. Then slowly, knock. Just one, clear and patient. Marcos cursed under his breath and said this was a bad idea, but none of us moved. It felt like we were locked into something now, like walking away would somehow make it worse. So I asked the question that I think we were all afraid of. "Are you inside the coffin?" The pause that followed lasted so long I started to relax. Maybe the sound had been something else after all. Maybe we had reached the end of whatever strange coincidence was happening. Then the ground answered. Knock. By then, the tension was unbearable. Every sound in the cemetery seemed louder, every shadow deeper. Lucas wiped sweat from his forehead, even though the night was cold. "Let's ask something harder," he said quietly. "Something it shouldn't know." I didn't like the idea, but curiosity was still stronger than fear. So Marcos stepped closer to the tombstone and spoke toward the ground. "How many people are standing here?" A few seconds passed. Then the response came. Knock, knock, knock. 3 distinct taps from below the soil. None of us spoke for several seconds after that. The sound had been too precise, too accurate. There were exactly 3 of us standing there. I felt something shift in my stomach then, a heavy sinking feeling that we had crossed some invisible line. Lucas looked down at the grave again, his face pale in the flashlight beam. "If you can hear us," he said slowly, "can you tell us something about ourselves?" For the first time since we started, the answer didn't come immediately. Instead, there was a long silence that stretched on, broken only by the wind sliding through the cemetery. I remember thinking maybe whatever was answering had finally stopped. Maybe we had pushed too far. Then suddenly the knocking started again. But this time it wasn't just 1 or 2 taps. It was a series of slow, deliberate knocks, forming a pattern. We stood frozen, listening. The rhythm was uneven at first, then gradually became clearer. Tap, pause, tap, tap, pause, tap, tap, tap. It sounded like someone trying to communicate something more complicated than yes or no. Marcos whispered that maybe it was random, but deep down, we all knew it wasn't. The pattern continued, each knock spaced carefully apart like someone spelling something out. And then it stopped. Silence swallowed the cemetery again. None of us understood what the pattern meant, but the feeling that something intelligent was beneath us had become impossible to ignore. Lucas leaned closer to the grave, his voice barely louder than a whisper. "If you know who we are, knock once for the person you want to talk to." We held our breath. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then a single knock echoed from underground. The sound seemed louder now, closer somehow, as if whatever was beneath the coffin had moved upward through the dirt. Lucas swallowed hard. "Okay," he said nervously. "Knock once for me, twice for Marcos, 3 times for him." He pointed at me. The pause that followed felt endless. My chest tightened as we waited. Then the knocking came. Knock, knock, knock. 3 slow taps from beneath the grave. My stomach dropped. Lucas and Marcos both turned toward me at the exact same time. I tried to laugh it off, but the sound that came out of my mouth didn't even resemble a laugh. "Very funny," I muttered, even though none of us had touched the ground. My hands were shaking now.
Lucas crouched lower and stared at the dirt like he expected something to burst through it. "If you want to talk to him," he said slowly, pointing at me again, "knock once." Immediately, the ground responded. Knock. I felt a chill spread down my spine. Something beneath that grave had just chosen me. My throat felt tight, but I forced myself to speak. What do you want?" The cemetery fell silent again. No wind, no insects, just the darkness pressing in around us. I waited for the usual 1 or 2 knocks, but they didn't come. Instead, the ground began tapping again in that strange pattern, slow and careful, like someone forming words. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, 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 tap. The sequence continued for several seconds before stopping abruptly. We stood there trying to understand it, but none of us knew how to translate the pattern. Then Lucas suddenly whispered, "Wait, listen." At first I thought he meant the knocking had started again, but it hadn't. The cemetery was completely quiet, too quiet. And then we heard something else. A voice, not loud, not clear, just a faint sound drifting up through the soil beneath the tombstone. It was weak and distorted, like someone speaking through layers of earth and wood. We leaned closer without even realizing we were doing it, every nerve in my body screaming that we shouldn't. The sound came again, just barely audible. And then it said my name. Not a whisper in the wind, not a trick of imagination. My name. Spoken slowly from somewhere beneath the coffin buried in that grave. None of us stayed another second after that. We ran. I don't remember grabbing my backpack or turning off my flashlight or even looking behind me. All I remember is the sound of our footsteps pounding across the cemetery path as we sprinted toward the gate. None of us spoke until we reached the car, and even then, the only thing we said to each other was that we were never coming back. For weeks afterward, we tried to convince ourselves it had been some kind of prank or weird acoustic trick, or maybe even our imagination feeding off fear. But 3 months later, something happened that made it impossible to ignore. I was home alone one night, sitting in my room with the lights off, scrolling on my phone. The house was completely silent except for the ticking of a clock in the hallway. Then I heard a sound coming from the wall beside my bed. A slow, hollow knock. I froze instantly, staring at the drywall. A few seconds later, it came again. Knock. The exact same sound we heard in the cemetery. My chest tightened as I listened. And then, from inside the wall, something knocked 3 times. Knock, knock, knock. If you have ever walked through a cemetery at night, you probably believe the same thing most people do, that once the dirt is thrown over a coffin, whatever is inside stays there forever, that the dead remain silent, that the ground does not move. I used to believe that too. I believed it for most of my life, until the night I buried something that should never have been buried in sacred ground. I am an old man now, and there are things I hear when the nights grow quiet that no priest has ever been able to explain. I have spent decades asking myself the same question. What exactly did we put into that grave? Because I know one thing with absolute certainty. It was not human. I remember the coffin. I remember the symbols carved into the wood. I remember the priest who refused to come anywhere near the cemetery that night. And most of all, I remember the sound that started 3 nights after the burial. The sound of scratching from beneath the ground. I have tried to convince myself for years that it was animals or shifting soil or the imagination of a tired old gravedigger. But animals do not breathe under 6 feet of earth, and the ground does not rise unless something underneath is pushing upward. I was the night gravedigger for a small rural cemetery back then,
A quiet place sitting on a hill outside a forgotten town surrounded by tall pine trees that groaned whenever the wind passed through them. Most nights were peaceful. My job was simple: dig graves, close them, keep the grounds clean, and make sure no one wandered through the gates after dark. I had spent so many nights among the graves that the silence of the place had become comforting. But the night those men arrived, something about the air felt wrong long before I even saw their cars. A heavy fog had rolled in early, and the cemetery lamps barely lit the narrow dirt road leading to the gates. Then the headlights appeared. 3 black vehicles moving slowly through the mist like shadows crawling up the hill. Funerals almost never happened that late, and when they did, there were usually grieving families, flowers, and quiet prayers echoing between the tombstones. But when the cars stopped and the doors opened, only 5 men stepped out, all wearing dark coats, all silent, all with the same strained expression on their faces. They did not look like men attending a funeral. They looked like men trying to bury a secret. One of them approached me and said they needed the burial done immediately. No ceremony, no prayer, no delay, just the coffin in the ground before midnight. I asked where the priest was, because even the smallest burials in that town always had someone to bless the grave. The man glanced back toward the road and then said quietly that the priest had refused to come. Not that he was unavailable, not that he was sick. He refused. When I asked why, the man simply said, "He said he would not stand over that coffin." Something about the way he said it made the air feel colder around us. That was when they opened the back of one of the vehicles and pulled out the coffin. I have carried thousands of coffins in my life, and you develop a sense for the weight of them. But the moment the men tried to lift that one, the metal rails groaned under the strain. Whatever was inside was far heavier than a human body had any right to be. When I stepped closer to help them, the first thing I noticed was the wood. It was darker than any coffin I had ever seen, almost black, polished but strangely dull, like it absorbed the light instead of reflecting it. Then I noticed the carvings. Symbols covered the entire lid from one end to the other, deep, jagged shapes that twisted together in patterns I could not recognize. They did not look like crosses or religious engravings. They looked ancient, harsh, almost like something meant to trap whatever was inside rather than honor it. I asked the men what the symbols meant, but none of them answered. One of them simply handed me a thick envelope filled with cash and told me to finish the job quickly. Earlier that day, they had already instructed me to dig the grave deeper than normal. Most graves go down 6 feet. This one was closer to 8. The hole waited for us at the far edge of the cemetery where the trees grew thick and the headstones were older than any living person in town. When we carried the coffin there, I felt something strange through the handles gripping the sides. A vibration. Not violent, just a faint trembling humming through the wood like distant machinery running inside the box. I remember staring down at it, wondering if I had imagined it. But before I could say anything, the men quickly lowered the coffin into the grave. It struck the bottom with a heavy thud that echoed against the walls of the hole. Then one of the men pulled a small metal disc from his coat pocket and tossed it down onto the coffin lid. The disc had the same symbols carved into it as the wood. When I asked what it was, he gave a quiet answer that I still remember word for word. Insurance. They stood there watching while I shoveled the first piles of dirt back into the grave. Normally people cry or look away during that moment, but these men did not move. They stared at the hole as if they were waiting for something terrible to happen. Halfway through filling the grave, I heard a sound that made my hands freeze around the shovel. A knock, hollow and dull, coming from beneath the dirt. I thought maybe the shovel had struck the coffin lid, but then it came again. Knock. The men exchanged quick, nervous glances. One of them said the coffin was just settling under the weight of the soil, but the way his voice shook made it clear he did not believe his own explanation. After a few seconds, the sound stopped, and the silence returned. I finished filling the grave while the men watched every movement I made. When the mound of earth was finally smooth and packed down under the moonlight, they left without another word. For 3 days, nothing happened. Then, on the 4th night, while I was making my usual rounds near midnight, I heard something strange drifting through the cemetery. At first, it sounded like an animal digging somewhere in the distance, but as I followed the noise across the graves, a cold feeling spread through my chest when I realized exactly where the sound was coming from. The new grave. I stood there in the fog, listening carefully. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound was slow and deliberate, like fingernails dragging across wood from the inside of a coffin. I told myself it had to be rats trapped in the soil, but when I pressed my boot down onto the dirt mound, the scratching stopped instantly. The silence that followed felt unnatural, like something beneath the earth had suddenly realized I was standing there. The scratching returned the next night, and the night after that. Each time it grew louder, more desperate, sometimes followed by dull thuds that sounded like something shifting violently inside a wooden box. I began avoiding that part of the cemetery entirely, but the sound carried through the quiet night air no matter where I walked. Then came the night the ground moved. I had just passed the far edge of the cemetery when the scratching erupted louder than ever before, frantic and violent beneath the soil. I turned toward the grave and felt my stomach twist as the mound of dirt began trembling under my boots. At first it was subtle, like loose earth settling. Then the center of the mound slowly bulged upward as if something beneath it was pushing against the soil. Scratch. Scratch. Thud. I stepped back in terror as the ground rose again, this time higher. Then I heard it. A deep, wet, inhaling sound coming from beneath the earth. Breathing. Something buried under 8 feet of dirt was breathing. The soil suddenly cracked open in jagged lines across the surface of the grave, splitting apart as if something below was forcing its way upward. I ran without looking back. The next morning, I returned with the town sheriff and told him everything. He laughed all the way to the graveyard gate. But when we reached the burial site, the laughter stopped. The mound of dirt was split open by long cracks. The sheriff brushed the soil away until the lid of the coffin was visible. Deep claw-like gouges covered the wood, tearing through the strange symbols carved into the surface. He looked up at me and asked quietly if I had opened the grave. I told him no. Neither of us spoke again after that. We covered the coffin back up and packed the earth down as tightly as we could before leaving the cemetery. That was 40 years ago. The place has long since been abandoned, swallowed by weeds and broken stones, and no one in town dares to walk near it after sunset. But sometimes, when the wind dies and the night becomes very still, I drive past the rusted cemetery gates and sit in my truck for a few minutes. And every once in a while, when the world is quiet enough, I hear it again, scratching beneath the ground.